fixed a butterfly to a board with a pin. Occasionally, what he'd listened to an hour or so later wasn't even half bad. More often, though, what he heard was nonsense, and even before he stopped playing, he'd concluded that it was a waste of time. He wasn't actually dreaming of music. He was only dreaming of playing it. The texture and resistance of the keys under his fingertips, the beer residue and the metal mesh of the mic on his lips, the bass rumble from the stage through his torso, and more lately that rarest feeling of getting picked up and carried by the music itself. No more distinction between him and the keyboard, between him and those he played with, between crowd and band, all of them racing along with the same roar, the communion of that, the freedom. The paisley sheet his mother had made up the couch with had gotten tangled around his thighs in the night. He yanked it up toward his chin, but without much hope of getting back to sleep. The stillness of the house was deafening somehow, like all the sleeping people were vibrating at a frequency only he could hear, his family ringing in his ears. He kicked off the sheet and sat up, grabbed his jeans, crumpled on top of his duffel bag, and took out a sweatshirt. He climbed the carpeted stairs as he pushed his arms through the sleeves. Above the rail to his right were taped a dozen or more crayon drawings on white paper. Houses and suns, oceans and triangle-sailed boats. Violent, inchoate swirls that resembled things he'd seen when he dropped acid in the Mall of America before a show in St. Paul. "The fridge just isn't big enough when we all get together," his mother had exclaimed as she'd let him down the night before, as though he were some kind of stranger, as though she were a tour guide, explaining to a foreigner what it was like when they were together. But he reminded himself, if he'd been absent for so long, he had only himself to blame. Fixed on the door at the top of the stairs was more kid art. Brown, hand-shaped cutouts of different sizes with glued-on elaborations. Yellow feet, red-orange waddles, plastic googly eyes, to establish that these were turkeys. "Happy Thanksgiving," one of his nieces or nephews had written in careful elementary school cursive on a piece of construction paper, masking taped above the doorknob. For some reason, it struck him like an ultimatum. He opened the door a crack, listened. More tinnitus quiet. No one else was up. He moved as softly as he could down the corridor toward the front hall. When he was a teenager, he'd snuck out so often, and apparently so needfully, he'd been able to make this trip without turning on a single light. The 12 stairs up from the basement, left, and down this hall to the front door, his hand reaching the knob in the dark by pure muscle memory. Then he'd get into his father's car, put it in neutral, and roll down to the end of the driveway, only then turning on the engine. And from there it was off to some friends or to some agreed-upon clearing in the woods, bottle caps and butts littering the ground like pine needles. Or if there was nothing going on, he and his friends would drive around the campus of the local state college, hoping to stumble on a party, smoking weed and listening to cassettes of Mudhoney, Guster, Pearl Jam, NWA. He knew he shouldn't look back on those nights quite so fondly, but he couldn't help it. Yes, it was drugs and alcohol-laden fun, but it was still fun. He carefully opened the coat closet. The old ski jacket that his mother had pulled from somewhere was hanging next to the blue peacoat he'd worn from San Francisco. Within 60 seconds of his walking in, his mother had declared the peacoat too nice for the game of touch football planned for the following afternoon, and bustled around upstairs until she produced the ancient jacket. He'd tried to tell her he'd bought the peacoat for $40 at a thrift store almost a decade ago. And anyway, there was no reason to find an alternative at 11 o'clock at night. But she ignored him. And when she held out the ski jacket, of course he took it. Of course he tried it on, and though the synthetic fabric was so stiff with age it was almost sharp, he declared that it was perfect and thanked her some more. Why? Because he wanted to be agreeable. Amenable, he thought as he took his cigarettes from the pocket of the peacoat.